I'm just going to focus on the politics at the start. I won't go through the detail of the results, which has been well carried in the press. But clearly the big winner is Prime Minister Erdoğan himself, and he will take this outcome as an endorsement of his own position and of his policies. I think it's important when looking at this election to say that certainly in the government, Turkish government's vision, it was always round one of 3 rounds, important in its own right, but also setting the battleground for the presidential elections and the forthcoming general elections, whenever they are due to be held. It ended up, for reasons with which you'll all be familiar, as a referendum on Prime Minister Erdoğan himself, and he clearly made the right calculation on his support in his political heartland and on the numerical strength he could find there. And it was a clear policy of concentrating from the time of Gezi Park on consolidating his base rather than trying to win over the undecided. And he's shown that he can win an election resoundingly without the involvement of some whose support he had before. What this result also shows is that his core constituency still see him as their best champion. He's done well for them economically, socially, politically. They don't seem to care or believe the allegations made, circulated so widely in Turkey and internationally, nor the effect we've seen on the rule of law architecture in recent months. They seem to take the view that the tide has risen benefiting all of them, and they've continued to support the Prime Minister. Very much a personal endorsement. I think what the result has also shown is the difficulty for the opposition in beating the AKP if they remain divided and when the economy is still doing comparatively well. Now, if we look at what's likely to happen now, I think we're going to move straight into pre-electoral confrontation. The AKP are very energetic, and we'll see if the opposition are equally energetic. But there's going to be no resting on the result and move towards harmonization and so on. I think we're going to see continuing polarization ahead of a decision on the presidential elections and ahead of the next general election. And the outcome we've just seen strongly places Prime Minister Erdoğan for a decision on whether to run for the presidency or to remain as Prime Minister. There's been a lot of speculation about which of these is more likely. There are entirely logical arguments for a decision either way. I think he possibly hadn't taken a decision until seeing what the results of these elections just past were, because now he's in a very different position for negotiations than he would have been if the results had been disappointing. And he is, of course, only barred from standing as Prime Minister again by a party regulation, not by a legal regulation. And I would argue that if he wanted to change that rule, and I don't know that he does, he could easily do it, and he could justify it on the basis of needing to deal with the conspirators who now demand new conditions in Turkish politics. So if I had to put my money on whether he'd run for president or prime minister, I wouldn't, because I don't yet have a firm basis for knowing. Some would argue that in many ways Erdoğan is more suited to be prime minister and Gül is more suited to be president. We don't know the answer to that one either. But there's a decision to be made now, and made quickly. I think the other factor is that all policy decisions now are going to be heavily influenced by the prospect of elections. So the main interest in this is the Prime Minister's had an endorsement of his Kurdish policy. It'll also be interesting to see, and Turco is going to talk about this, about the competition between long-term stability requirements for the economy and short-term electoral benefits. But I have no doubt that the approach of elections is going to weigh very heavily on all decision-making. What does all this mean for Turkey's friends like the UK and others? I think there are going to be some challenges. Turkey, of course, remains an extremely important economic partner, regional player, and Syria is still a problem for us all, and political partner, NATO ally, and so on. But I think there will be tensions over our concerns over some of the issues of freedom of expression and the rule of law architecture, and I don't think that these concerns will be tremendously welcomed in the run-up to elections. I think it's also fair to say that the Prime Minister of Turkey is likely to be more influenced by domestic electoral considerations than by the views of his friends. But for the outside players, I think we will be likely, and I'm out of date already, to argue for continuing reform. And in the UK view, this means continuing with the EU accession process to try and help bring Turkey into line with EU norms in some of the areas that have been difficult recently. So whatever happens, as ever in Turkey, I think the coming months are going to be lively, complex, fascinating, and we're still asking questions rather than providing answers.
Markets, yes, they seem to enjoy the results. Markets do not have a taste for any political preferences. What they care is the political stability. And I think their priorities right now is this is something, or in some certain degree that a risk that they can calculate going forward, because Turkey has been like a safe haven of political risk for such a long time. And then it was first tested last year in May. And then we had, let's say, a very long summer, but over the December-March period, many were caught off guard, and they were kind of thinking that maybe things can be much, much more different than they had envisaged before. And the initial, or the first test was the local elections, because you still have the presidential elections, parliamentary elections. So it's kind of a relief for the markets to see that AK Party is winning. But I'm going to just talk about that, there's a disconnect between this short-term relief and the long-term story that Turkey is facing. I think that we have to, we shouldn't read that much from this market's reaction for basically two reasons. As I said, last year, since probably the EM sell-off in the second half of the year, the positioning was very light already in Turkey, because from a fundamental point of view, Turkey was seen one of the weakest investment stories. So many investors kind of reduced their exposure to Turkish assets. And then over the Christmas period, over the holidays period, there was this political crisis. Many caught on either holidays or off guard, as I mentioned. So they were not able to respond on this one as well. And then they were sidelined for a good 3 months, I should say, because they simply couldn't get their head around what's happening. I mean, imagine somebody bought, Turkish asset last year thinking that this is the investment grade story, the rising star of the next 5-10 years, and all of a sudden, a corruption case comes out. They don't know about the, major players in this, they think there's a single majority government, and then they start asking questions who are the parts in this fight. You say this is the single majority government, a popular prime minister. On the other hand, there is Gülen movement, and then they ask okay, who's the leader of this Gülen movement? Is it somebody's elected, represented in Turkey? And then story gets more and more complicated for the first time. For the first time takers of political risk, let's put it that way. And from that point of view, of course, they just wish that this is gonna go away anytime soon. So this relief is related to that initial point of too complex problem. They wanted to oversimplify it to an election result, and the first test was the local elections. The second point, as I mentioned, the market's relation with this political risk is a different kind. Markets and politics always interact, but the market's take is a chartist one, very simplistic one. And on that one, of course, all that quant models or some sophisticated frameworks are there to predict market prices or the macro indicators, but politics is treated merely unpredictable. So on that regard, they were just waiting a solid sign that how this is going to play out, and the election result for them is kind of a proof But if you consider those scenarios before the election, there are three of them. Like, the market was thinking, or the consensus, thinking that if AK Party gets 45%, markets rally, we're going to live, happy ever after. And yes, people may take it to the street. There will be further political noise. This fight is not going to be over. But as long as it doesn't change the election results, why we should care? And the second outcome was kind of 40% to 45%, because last election performance was like 39% for AK Party. So they thought, yeah, on that scenario, there might be some further uncertainties compared to 45, but eventually this is market positive, markets rally. So the only scenario that the market was very skeptic or like scared of seeing was AK Party getting below 40%. And why? Because they thought that in such a scenario, presidential elections are going to be at risk. And then AK Party may even lose the parliamentary elections. There might be a coalition government. And this is something they didn't see in Turkey over the last 10, 12 years. So they kind of thought that this is the ugliest scenario, markets gonna sell off. So as you see, this is an overly simplified version of markets' take on politics. I mean, thanks God, in Bank of America Merrill Lynch, compliance and legal doesn't allow me to write purely political analysis or do any election scenarios, because I would just turn those scenarios upside down. I would just argue that the short term relief for the markets is going to be a risk for the medium term, like plus 45%. I would say this is probably going to be a risk factor. And then below 40, initially it might be negative, but then I would argue that in the medium term, maybe it will just offer a silver lining, a chance for a change for the better in Turkey, because I think politics is turning a liability for macro outlook. And why I say that, just very quick couple of points, and then maybe we can discuss more in Q&A session. Think in this way. Turkey's growth model is no longer sustainable. Why I say so? Because Turkey levers heavily on the domestic demand or domestic market, but they don't have the domestic savings. So what they need is capital inflows. This is a very high current account deficit creating growth model, but the global backdrop is changing. So the abundant dollar liquidity is not out there, it's getting less, it's getting more expensive. So you have to pay the price to get that dollars if you just carry on as you have been doing for the last couple of years. The second point is the government, and this is Prime Minister Erdoğan's own words, they don't care about what the rest of the world is thinking about what they're doing. So they're more inward looking. So think about a government that is becoming more inward looking, but an economic model completely outward looking, depending on capital inflow. So there's a fundamental inconsistency between these two tendencies. And the second part of this equation for me is looking at the local market, because AK Party, for example, is now kind of vindicated with the election results, but there's a good half of the society that didn't vote for AK Party, that they feel uncomfortable, they feel a threat over their lifestyle. And think about Turkish domestic savings, that the savings I mentioned, small in terms of emerging market scale, but they're held mostly by those, high educated urban dwellers, both couples are working. So a little bit non-AK Party voters. So in a way, they feel as a last 5 years comparison, they no longer happy to carry on with this negative real interest rates on their TRY savings. So from a domestic resources or savings perspective, this is not fundable as well, because those people are seeing, for example, their saving habits kind of a reflection as a safety buffer for their lifestyles, not anymore just an pure economic decision. So if you add these two together, you see that actually last couple of years, last 5 years, Turkish potential growth has been coming down. And now this potential growth is close to nearly 3%, coming down from 4.5%. Before 2008 crisis, it was 5.5%. So rather than this low real interest rates generating a growth boom in Turkey, it just created a misallocation of capital over the last 5-8 years. But in order for us to discuss these kind of fundamental problems, we have to actually maybe keep our eyes away from this short-term political distractions or like short-term political preferences on macro policies, and we have to focus on medium and long-term. And on that one, we suggest that Turkey, the preferences in terms of the political preferences, if you compare with what Turkey needs to do for medium term, are inconsistent in a way that Turkey seems to be in a middle income trap for the time being. In order to get out of this middle income trap, what they need to do is actually go for innovation rather than imitation, just improve the property rights, rule of law. They have to invest in human capital. So if you think this polarization in the country, diminishing rule of power, or diminishing separation of power and rule of law, those are not good signs for the medium term. So even many things that the verdict on Erdoğan and government is going to be probably dependent on the economic outcome, and it may not create any imminent threat. I think from a medium and long-term perspective, there is a significant inconsistency between short-term political preferences and what Turkey needs to do.
I will explain, first of all, why did Prime Minister Erdoğan win the elections? Because I think this has not been adequately, dealt with in the media and policy institutes. And secondly, what the future holds for Turkey. In terms of why did the Prime Minister Erdoğan win? First advantage that Prime Minister Erdoğan has is if you look at the distribution of Turkish voters. The vast majority of Turkish voters are on the right wing of Turkish politics. That is, on the conservative, religious, nationalist right. Around 2/3 of Turkish voters on the nationalist, religious right. And about 30% are on the left, which means Turkish secular, which means Kemalism. And in the middle, you have an assortment of center-right and the Kurdish nationalists. So immediately, Prime Minister Erdoğan has a built-in advantage. All he needs to do is appeal to 2/3 of the Turkish electorate, and if he gets a majority of them, he gets 45%. And that's what his strategy has been in the elections. The second reason, I think, it's the economy. I don't think Prime Minister Erdoğan's voters do care too much about corruption, or they care too much about media freedoms. Their main concern are bread and butter economic issues. And you find that in survey after surveys. If you ask voters in Turkey, or respondents, what priorities do you have? Number one is the economy. Corruption comes at the bottom, or near the bottom. Media freedoms come at near the bottom. So for the average Turkish voter, the economy comes number one. And for that, the urban poor in Turkey, the rural voters, and the working class have tended to see Prime Minister Erdoğan as a champion for the poor. This is a reversal of Europe. In Europe, traditionally, it's the left-wing parties seen as in favor of the poor and the working class, and the right-wing parties in favor of the elites. In Turkey, it's the reverse. Left-wing parties are seen as elitist, and the right-wing parties, conservative religious parties, are seen as in favor of the poor. And Prime Minister Erdoğan's manifestation of that image has helped him to continue winning over sizable segments of the Turkish population. The third is that we've seen I think these elections have put, at least should push people to question the romanticization of social media websites. We've seen when Prime Minister Erdoğan banned Twitter, we saw a lot of comments in the media and about the Twitter generation, and about Twitter helping mobilize the Gezi Park protests in the summer of last year. One has to keep the issue of social media into perspective. Only 34% of Turks access the internet. It's just a third. And 15% of Turks access Twitter. So when you take Twitter, it's only 15% of the Turkish population. And the Turks who do access Twitter tend to be tech-savvy, globally connected Turks. And it's fair to assume that they tend to vote against Prime Minister Erdoğan. So we saw a lot of the romanticization of the social media in the social media networking websites in the media, and I think that these elections should put the importance of social media into perspective. Now, the second part that I'm going to talk about is what does the future hold? I think that Turkey is entering a new era now. In the past, if you look in the past 50 years, Turkey had a boom and bust economy, pretty much. High populist spending, high inflation, then followed by economic retrenchment, cutting budgets, and so forth. So you had the boom and bust. I think what Turkey now is entering is economic stagnation. And I think this is the first time, I would say, the first time in the Turkey's modern republic is entering into such a, what do you mean by stagnation? It's moving sideways. Neither booming, but nor is it collapsing. What we're seeing is stagnation. And as Turker mentioned, 3% growth rates over the long term. And that's very, very slow for a country like Turkey. For a developing country like Turkey, that's very, very slow growth. What does that mean in terms of Prime Minister Erdogan's future? I think it's the beginning of the decline of Prime Minister Erdogan. These elections show that it's the beginning of the decline, despite the excellent result he achieved. Why? If you look at each election, Prime Minister Erdogan achieved a higher and higher percentage of the vote. In 2002, Prime Minister Erdogan got 34% of the vote, 2002 general elections. In the 2004 local elections, he got 42%. So already he climbed from 34 to 42 in a matter of 2 years. Then, in 2007 general elections, he got 47%. 2009, it went down to 39. Then it went back up in the 2011 general elections to 50%. Now it's down to 45. If you take out 2009, you will see that each vote at each election, whether local or general, his vote went up and up and up. This is the first time his vote went down for domestic reasons. The 2009 elections, there was a global recession. So we cannot blame Prime Minister Erdogan for the impacts of the global recession on the Turkish economy. That was not his fault or the fault of his policies. So one can exclude that. That was a unique event. But in this year's election, we've seen a decline from 50 to 45, simply because his economic numbers are beginning to deteriorate. If you ask Turkish voters now, we're seeing we're seeing more and more Turks are beginning to have a negative view of the government's economic performance. It's still starting now. The negativity is starting to go up, but still it's early days. I think over time, over the long term, we'll see his numbers begin to slip gradually, not suddenly, but gradually, a few percentage points perhaps every few months. And this indicates to me in the longer term that Turkey is entering now a prolonged period of political and economic instability, whether Prime Minister Erdogan is president or prime minister.